I want to tell you that the best part of the show, Nobody Wants This, the part they truly nailed, is what it's like for a rabbi to date, or for someone else to date a rabbi. It's not really just a job. It's not just a question of work-life balance. It's who you are, and it's who you are all the time. In a restaurant, on the street, if you happen to find yourself in a sex shop, you're still the rabbi, no matter what. Now, when I started working as a rabbi, first as a rabbinic intern and then as an assistant rabbi some 25 years ago, I thought that it was like having 100 bubbies, because everybody had an opinion and had something they wanted to say and wanted me to hear, and someone they wanted me to meet, and suggestions and things I should do. And everyone had something to say, and I took it with good grace, because what else was I going to do? But it really was being in a fishbowl all the time. And there is a word out there that is fallen out of favor, but people still know what it means. It's rebbitzin. The rebbitzin is the rabbi's wife. By the way, never call my wife that. She hates the word, because she said, why should my life be defined by your job? It's not who I am. But this concept of the rebbitzin, of the wife of the rabbi, sort of looms over you if you're trying to date someone, because they know what you're doing for a living. That comes out in date 1 or maybe date 2. And that means that's going to say something about what their life is going to be like. Now, I did ask at one time, what's the male equivalent for the rebbitzin if you're the husband of the rabbi or the wife of the rabbi? I'm sorry, or if you're the husband of the rabbi, whether it's a male rabbi or a female rabbi. And one of my colleagues came up with a phrase, well, I have to explain a little bit of Hebrew. So Rav is the general term in Hebrew for master of or for rabbi. Beitzim is the word for eggs, but also eggs has a euphemism meaning, you can probably guess. So she referred to, instead of the rebbitzin, he was the Rav Beitzim. He was the master of the Beitzim. So you could choose to use that if you'd like to, but it would require some explanation. Anyways, the point is, when I knew that I wanted to be a rabbi, I did actually ask myself the question underlying this show. Could I possibly date someone or marry someone who wasn't Jewish? I knew that it wouldn't be an issue of being accepted in our particular movement, because a colleague of mine in rabbinical school was intermarried, and there was never an issue with that. I thought maybe there might be a little bit of an issue with social acceptance, but our congregation was 30, 50% intermarried. I mean, it wasn't a case of I would be the oddball out in that circumstance. But I realized Judaism is really important to me. It's what I'm fascinated in. It's what I'm going to chit-chat about. And if I was dating someone who just couldn't relate, then maybe it would be a problem. I also realized what percent of my time is consumed, what percent of our bookshelves are going to be consumed with Jewish and philosophy, and, well, maybe it's going to be too much. And after all, there is sometimes some circumstances that, even if you don't call it a rebbitzin, the spouse is involved, the spouse is connected. It's a part of the flow and the experience. Now, I realize that Nobody Wants This was not a show designed just for me. But I want to tell you, this is one of the first Hollywood young rabbi experiences, shows, movies that really rang true to my experience. Now, we've certainly seen intermarriage depicted in Hollywood many, many times in all kinds of popular culture. In the original Jazz Singer, the first talking movie from 1927, Jack was raised to be a cantor and left it to become a popular jazz singer. He's come back to New York as his father is dying, and his father says, I need you to sing Kol Nidre. But of course, his opening night on Broadway is Kol Nidre. And so what is he going to do? He's torn between the opportunity for the big Broadway break and the longing after his father and the desire to sing the Kol Nidre. And what does he do? What's the Hollywood happy ending? They postpone the Broadway opening. He sings Kol Nidre before his father dies. And then on opening night on Broadway, with blackface on, which is a whole nother conversation, he stands up to perform. And who is in the audience in the front row? His blonde showgirl girlfriend sitting next to his Yiddish mama. You can have it all. They don't even talk about the intermarriage angle on it, but it's obvious by the casting that this is a sign of his temptation to the outside world, but his ability to have it all, to have his girlfriend sitting next to his mama, and everything works out fine. In 1964, on Broadway, Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof faces the challenge of intermarriage. His third daughter, Chava, is marrying a Ukrainian man named Fyetka. She marries out, ultimately, even though he says no, he doesn't approve. But at the end of the show, he says, make sure she dresses warm. He shows that he cares about her in some way. I will point out, in the original Sholem Aleichem stories that were the basis for Fiddler on the Roof, he does not accept her. She's gone. In fact, he ends that story with, but enough about that sad news. Let's talk about something more cheerful. Have you heard about the cholera epidemic in Odessa? Which from Sholem Aleichem is more cheerful than talking about this intermarriage saga. There's a movie version of Fiddler on the Roof, or it wasn't called Fiddler on the Roof, it's called The Tevye and His Daughters, Tevye the Milkman. And it shows him sitting Shiva, literally on the ground, dark windows, everything, because it was a death for them. But in the Broadway version of the story, it's a somewhat happier ending. There's still tension, but on some level, he accepts her. In 1972, CBS aired a sitcom. It was called Bridget Loves Bernie. It was about a young, blonde, Irish Catholic woman from a wealthy family who fell in love and ultimately married a Jewish cab driver whose parents owned a deli. It was culture clash. It was tension. It was interreligious dialogue, debate. It was the number 5 show on TV. And it was canceled after 1 season because back then, nobody wanted that. In the year 2000, a movie came out called Keeping the Faith. Keeping the Faith was about a love triangle, but a very unconventional love triangle. There was a Jewish male rabbi. There was a male priest. Of course, the only kind of Catholic priests are male, but there was a male priest, and there was a blonde, non-Jewish woman who was desired by both of the men. But the priest couldn't have her because he was a priest and celibate, and the rabbi couldn't have her because he was a rabbi and she wasn't Jewish. And what were they going to do? What was the Hollywood happy ending there? She secretly planned to convert. She solved the issue by becoming Jewish. No more problem. All solved. Well, maybe. And now we have, in 2024, Nobody Wants This. It's a big hit, but it's also pushing buttons. And so we'll talk a little bit about those buttons. Now, I do want to warn you that there will be spoilers, because I'm going to talk about the whole series. And I've noticed that some of the articles written about the series seem like they haven't watched the last couple episodes, or the characters really change by the end from how you thought about them at the beginning, some of them. And so I want to tell you about the whole series as it is now at the end of season 1, because there is going to be a second season. So we'll see where it is. But as a quick plot summary, Adam Brody plays the charming Rabbi Noah, aka Hot Rabbi. He is fun and he's clever and he's insightful. He has a great interpersonal intelligence and can read people very well. There's a lot of touching and fun and clever dialogue between Noah and Joanne. Joanne is the non-Jewish, blonde, atheist, sex podcaster who runs a podcast with her sister where they talk about everything related to sex and relationships, but it seems like a lot of sex. She's small, very small, but she's smart and funny, and she's that terrible word, shiksa. Evidently, they were debating calling the series that at one point, and wiser heads prevailed. Shiksa is a slur for a non-Jewish woman. It actually has its origins with the Hebrew term for a creepy, crawly insect. So it's not a good thing. And it's not even the kind of thing you can save by saying a lot, even though they try to in the show. So I want to focus on 3 issues and then open up for discussion, conversation, and response. The 3 issues are, what's the reality of intermarriage today, not the year 2000 or 1970 or even earlier, 1927. Secondly, what are some of the conflicts in the show and how do those relate to the complex reality we actually live. Because, of course, the show is a limited version of reality, not a documentary. And third, we have to talk about how Jewish women are portrayed in the show. This has been a very hot topic on the interwebs, and I do want to touch on this issue because I think it is an important part of this dynamic. After all, maybe the fact that this Jewish man, this quintessentially Jewish man who's a rabbi, the fact that he's choosing a non-Jewish woman, what does that say about all the possible Jewish women out there? Is he done with them? What's wrong with them? So maybe even the premise of the show is a provocation. So let's talk about the realities of intermarriage. We'll talk about what kind of rabbi is in a little bit. No, it's not clear. So first, the realities of intermarriage today in 2024. Since the mid-1990s, and so for over the past 30 years, over 50% of marriages involving non-Orthodox Jews have been intermarriages, both men and women. Now, it used to be in the 70s and 80s, men intermarried much higher than women did. So that meant that the children would not be recognized as Jewish by traditional definitions. If the man is marrying a non-Jewish woman, then the kids wouldn't be recognized. Now, if a Jewish woman marries a non-Jewish man because the mother's Jewish, in theory, it should be an easy process for them to feel welcome in a community. But of course, it hasn't worked out that way. Now, the American Reform Movement in the early 1980s did pass a resolution saying that they would recognize what they called patrilineal descent, or the father being Jewish would be enough, so that Johnny Schwartz could be Jewish even if his mother was not. If, however, they said, he were raised exclusively Jewish. What does that mean? Well, it could be interpreted to mean no church, no catechism, no Catholic confirmation, but it could also be no Christmas tree. And for secularized Christians who maybe never want to go to church, but they want their Christmas tree because that's their family tradition and their warm memories and all those experiences. And well, does that disqualify the child from counting as Jewish? Well, depends how you read that declaration. But of course, families made their own choices. No matter what the doctrines said of the institutions, people kept getting married. The 1990 U.S. Jewish population study showed this 50% figure, and the Jewish community flipped out and put in tons of energy to prevent intermarriage and to encourage Jewish identity. And 10 years later, they did another Jewish study, and 50% of the marriages were intermarriage. And then 10 years later, another 50%. It's been consistently 50 or higher, no matter what you say or do, because people fall in love and they want to get married. And the rabbi saying no doesn't stop them. They just get married some other way, or some other clergy, or they find a rabbi who's willing to do it. Our Rabbi Emeritus Daniel Friedman did something like 3,500 weddings in his rabbinic career, sometimes a dozen or 2 dozen in a weekend, because he was one of the only rabbis willing to do it. And there was a huge body of people who wanted a rabbi to participate in their ceremony. Now, he did some Jewish weddings, but the bulk of his weddings were a Jewish partner marrying a non-Jewish partner, wanting a rabbi there, and he was willing to do it, and he was one of the few who did in the 80s, even into the 90s and early 2000s. Families make their own choices, as exemplified by, of all people, Adam Brody, the actor. Before he was on this, that nobody wants, before he made this leap to being a rabbi, he actually played the child of an interfaith family on a show called The OC. And there was a groundbreaking episode in 2003 called The Best Christmaka Ever, about the holiday that his family celebrated, which is a combination of Hanukkah and Christmas. In fact, this year, with the dates coinciding, might be the best Christmaka ever. But the point of Christmaka was that families were already making their own choices, whatever the rabbis said, whatever the movement's doctrinaire proclamations were. They were going to do what they're going to do. They're going to make their own choices. And they didn't need to join a synagogue, and they didn't need to have the non-Jewish partner convert. They do it themselves these days. They get a friend ordained on the internet. They don't need the institutional endorsement to make it happen. But some institutions have become more welcoming, more open, more accepting. More rabbis are doing weddings. I do maybe 2 dozen weddings a year, not a weekend. because there are plenty of other rabbis doing it and other people doing weddings beyond the organized Jewish community. In the latest Pew study of American Jews, about 60% of intermarried families are raising their kids some variety of Jewish. It could be religiously Jewish or culturally Jewish or Jewish and something else, where in the 1990s, when that 50% figure came out, only about a quarter of intermarried families were raising their kids Jewish, and you could understand why. Because they showed up to ask the rabbi to do the wedding, and the rabbi said, "What a terrible thing. There will be no more Jews if you do this. You're continuing Hitler's work." You'd actually hear that. And you hear a little bit of that in the show, too, when the senior rabbi talks to Noah and says, you know, if people see the rabbi intermarrying, then they're going to intermarry, and then there will be no more Jews. As if intermarriage is a dead end, even though current data says it's not. I sometimes will share an old joke about intermarriage, but people today often don't get it. The joke is, a man brings home his fiancée to introduce to his mother, and he says, "Mama, I want you to meet my fiancée. She is a Native American woman, and her name is Running Deer." And the mother extends her hand gravely and says, "I'm sitting Shiva." Now, people may not get it these days. They may not know what sitting Shiva is. But it's also the fact that they just don't understand the reaction. Why is she acting like he's dead when he's marrying someone not Jewish? Why would anyone do that? For people living in the secular Jewish world, the liberal Reform Jewish world, even for most conservative Jews, that isn't the reaction you get these days. Now, some on the more conservative end of conservative, and certainly those in the Orthodox world, might still have that kind of a disaster, calamity reaction to that kind of a partnership. But even the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the main establishment organizational body, has a figure at their national office who is called the Director of Intermarriage Engagement and Inclusion in the conservative movement. I happen to know her. She's a friend, Karen McGinnity. However, for all of this acceptance of intermarriage by the movements and the organizations, a rabbi intermarrying, well, that's a different matter. The Reconstructionist Jewish movement has celebrated intermarriages and had their rabbis officiate at them for many, many years. But it was only in 2015 that they decided to allow intermarried people to become rabbis, to enter their rabbinical school and to be ordained. And the Reform movement, which accepted patrilineal descent all those years ago, they only decided to ordain rabbinic students who were intermarried 6 months ago in 2024. And so for all those years, they were telling people who happen to have a non-Jewish spouse, you're not good enough. Your partnership isn't good enough to be a rabbi, because after all, the rabbi is a model of Jewish behavior for the congregants. They're like the designated Jew. They have to do everything right. And if you're intermarried, you're doing something wrong. It's a moral failing, it's a Jewish failing, it's less than. Well, if you're telling rabbis this, what is that saying about the people in your pews? What is that saying about the people who are coming to you to marry them? You're saying that, well, something that no couple wants to hear. And that's the basis for the tension in Nobody Wants This. It's not just a lay Jew marrying a lay non-Jew who's an atheist. That's not really a big conflict, because it happens all the time. And people in urban, educated settings know lots of couples and lots of families like that. It's not unusual anymore. The Jew and non-Jewish partnership, yes, there's differences in their family dynamics and personalities, and they play a bit on that in the show. And of course, the individual man-woman dynamics and the personalities involved. The core tension here, what makes the show noteworthy, is the identity question. To quote Tevye when he's trying to dissuade his daughter, a bird may love a fish, but where will they build a home together? Well, maybe in Los Angeles in 2024. So the second theme is the show conflicts versus complex reality. And the number one thing I think the show has an impossible mission to present, but it doesn't do a good job at it anyways, is that Judaism is not just a religion. It's a culture, it's an ethnic group, it's a peoplehood, it's an identity that's not just what you believe or ritual practices that you follow. And they seem to take the approach of it's just this religious institution. But it's more complicated than that, and Jews know that. Notice, by the way, that when Joanne declares that she's going to be converting, does that resolve all the hostility from the family? Not at all. She's still the outsider. She's still the interloper. She's still a threat. It's not just a set of religious beliefs. She asks him in the very first episode when they meet, say something rabbinical. And he says, there's a fiddler on the roof. That's nothing about theology. That's about popular culture and literature and musicals. It's a complicated part of their relationship dynamic, too. There used to be a musical called I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. That's part of the dynamic here. Who's going to change? How far can you adjust who you are, what your dreams are, what your identity is for the person that you think you want to be with, for the person that you love, and how much is too far? And this is what makes this story beautiful and universal. You know, I used to wonder why The Jazz Singer is about Kol Nidre, but it was the first talking movie and was a smashing global success. It's such a Jewish story, but it's also a human story about parents and children, about the old country and the new country, about traditional culture and modern culture. Well, that's what this show is about. It's about the identity challenge of how do you connect to someone else and stay yourself? How do you be what they would want you to be, but still be true to your beliefs and values? What if your aspiration gets in the way of the partnership that you think you want? That's a universal question. That's a personal challenge. That's a human experience. So whether it's a rabbi and someone else or pick other kind of conflicts, that's what makes this a universal story. So let me answer the question of how Jewish is this rabbi anyways? So there's certainly emphasis on kosher food. They talk about how pork is not kosher. And when he goes to a restaurant, he says, I don't want any bacon on the salad. And she says, I want extra bacon. Of course, they flip out about the pork, and then the mother sneaks some bites of the prosciutto in the kitchen anyways, because of course it's so yummy. And of course, 80% of American Jews don't keep kosher. Or they might live in what's called kosher style. So milk and meat, not a big deal, but pork, cheeseburger, that's too much. You also even get the metaphor when the senior rabbi is talking to him about how, you know, we can't eat this food and we can't eat that food, and it seems like you like a sort of blonde crab cake, he's referring to as a euphemism, right? So the assumption is we don't eat non-kosher food, except, remember when Sasha has a special night, he thinks by himself, what food does he make for himself to eat after he gets high? Chicken Parmesan. They eat in restaurants all the time. At least the rabbi does. He eats at his non-Jewish friend's house. He drinks wine that non-Jewish people have opened, which you're not allowed to do if you're following strict kosher, because they might have secretly offered it to an idol somewhere. Well, what gives here? There's even a scene where he does a Shabbat blessing on candles in a restaurant, but his head is not covered. Unusual. Now, I'm fine not covering my head saying blessings. I do it all the time. But it'd be unusual for a rabbi that seems to be presenting himself as more traditional. Well, what denomination is he? This is a debate that's been going on. People who have zoomed in on the pictures have noticed the prayer books that they're using as props in the synagogue scene are conservative prayer books. However, he gets in a car and drives away after Shabbat. And his sister-in-law, Esther, shows up and honks her horn and demands that they get in the car to go home. So they're clearly driving on Shabbat. The ethos of their approach to non-Jewish people seems to be more conservative style. He's told, when he's talking about marrying people, can you marry gay people? He says, yes, I can marry two people who are the same sex as long as they're both Jewish. But Jew and non-Jew, that's a problem. Well, in the Reform movement, you can do it. The majority of Reform rabbis will now officiate at intermarriages. Conservative rabbis are not allowed to. So this is one of the areas where it's sort of ambiguous. Which movement is he? Which movement? I have a feeling they didn't want to nail it down precisely. But also it leads to this kind of confusion because after all, if you could find something more flexible, couldn't that just resolve the tension? You need to make the tension harder. If he was in an intermarriage affirming community, then it might still be an issue about the rabbi intermarrying or not, but it's a different conversation than a community that absolutely rejects them. And I think that's also one of the reasons why they make his parents Russian immigrants, because often it's the first couple generations that are less open to mixing and intermarrying in any ethnic group. So maybe that's an added layer they want to make more complicated, or to make Bina's behavior at least a little bit more explainable. So how Jewish is this rabbi? He's very committed to his Jewishness. But how observant is he? Comes and goes, it seems. Now, another piece that they used to create conflict, but I found totally ridiculous, is how absolutely ignorant Joanne is of anything related to Judaism. She doesn't even know what the word shalom means. Now, and she also never looks it up. Like, she doesn't know, she's supposed to be this great researcher. She does no research on anything Jewish, even though she's dating a rabbi for months. Now, I'm a little forgiving on some of those, because the script needs to explain to a general audience, what is this shalom thing they keep saying? What does shiksa mean? So they have a scene where that's explained. What does mazel tov mean? So they have to explain these buzzwords that we would know. But someone growing up in Los Angeles, in the areas in which she grew up, would have known. So I've never been to a bat mitzvah. Seems implausible. However, as a show, they're generally good on Jewish literacy and Jewish accuracy. I didn't look in the credits for who their consultants were, but evidently someone knew something that they were getting it mostly accurate. There are a few mistakes. So, for example, when they visit this Jewish summer camp and they see his rabbi that he knew growing up, Rabbi Shira, from the summer camp, they have a scene in her apartment, cabin, whatever it is, and on her mantle, there is a Hanukkah menorah that's fully lit up. It's electronic Hanukkah menorah on the mantle. It's summer. Why would she have a menorah? I mean, maybe there's some shtick there, I don't know, but I have a feeling it was the props department saying, oh, we need Jewish props. And they just put it up there. And you see a lot of menorahs on the mantelpiece of the Rocklov home as well when they visit Bina and Ilan. You'll see, oh, we've got to mark this as Jewish. How can we do that in vocabulary people will know? Mezuzah? No. Menorah. That they'll recognize. So some of it is for explanatory purposes, but sometimes it's just a mistake. The other one that I found totally ridiculous. I have to do this program at the summer camp I went to my whole life, including being a counselor there. But nobody will know that I'm there and will report back to anyone I know back in my job that I was here with this non-Jewish woman. I'm sorry. That's just absurd. They even have a nickname for him. He's the hot rabbi, right? One of the campers has this dream that he'll come back and reconnect with one of his old campers and fall in love with her. That they're not going to tell anyone? Okay. Now, he wants to be the head rabbi of this particular synagogue. And it comes out near the end, he grew up at this synagogue, just like he grew up at the summer camp. This head rabbi was his rabbi for his bar mitzvah. He said, how can I imagine 20 years ago when I did your bar mitzvah that you would be taking over for me as the head rabbi? Now, I actually have some experience in this department as well, trying to become the rabbi of the congregation you grew up in. I have to say, it doesn't always work out the way you expected it to. Now, admittedly, it would be hard. It would be hard to find even a Reform synagogue that would be happy to hire an intermarried rabbi. Even today. There may be some, I'm sure there are. If there are rabbinic students going through that are intermarried as of 6 months ago, then maybe there'll be jobs for them out there in the world. And there are intermarried families who actually like to speak to intermarried rabbis because they feel like they'll understand the experience. There's an asset there. And we have colleagues of mine in our movement who are intermarried and who do weddings and find that exact experience. In fact, one of my colleagues, Rabbi Denise Sanlarsky, wrote a book called The A to Z of Intermarriage, drawing on her own experience as well as what she's learned as a rabbi. But finding the pulpit in the traditional style of Jewish life that he's used to, that might have been legitimately hard to do. And of course, there's that emotional attachment to the congregation you grew up in and wanting to be there, that you can see why he's attached to that place. Now, I was hoping for more on one topic that they touched on but didn't get into, and that was the question of God. She says in the very first episode, I don't really believe in God. And it comes up occasionally. where she mentions, how could you believe this? And what made you think, are you really into this God stuff? He's a rabbi who really believes it. He's not a closet humanist. He really believes in this God stuff that he's doing and leading and teaching all the time. For example, there's a scene where she asks him, why do you believe all this? And he says, well, I just found a sense of comfort when I believed that the world made sense. That worked for me. And she seems open to it. She seems moved by it. She says it makes sense to her. It intrigues her. But she doesn't push back. Well, what about earthquakes? And what about disease? And she also doesn't pursue it that much. It's just sort of a cute scene, a profound moment, and then let's go to the movies, or they move on to the rest of their life. The God issue is sort of soft-pedaled in favor of either boy-girl dynamics, meeting cute, or the one with the misunderstanding, which happens, in every kind of sitcom, or they're grappling with the identity issue. It's not about the God issue, it's about the identity issue. And that's sort of the unexplained complexity where they're talking about Judaism as a religion, but what's really the battle is this identity question of who you are, not what you believe. Maybe it'll come up in season 2. After all, what if she's fine with being culturally Jewish? What if she says, I'd be happy to raise Jewish children, but I'm not going to be Jewish? What if I raise Jewish children, I become Jewish, but I don't like going to synagogue? Well, to be determined. So the last topic I want to touch on and then open up for comments and conversation, the question of Jewish women in the show. There are a lot of Jewish women featured in the show. There is his almost fiance, Rebecca. There is his sister-in-law, Esther. There's his mother, Bina. There's all of Esther's friends who are also Rebecca's friends. There's the busybodies at the synagogue. There's the people they're trying to set him up with. And there's Joanne and her sister and her mother, who are beyond Jewish women. Now, the creator of the show is a Jewish woman, but she's a convert. She's someone who became Jewish. And I only say that because she puts it into her self-description in describing how she came to write the show. Part of her experience becoming Jewish has become fodder for the show. It's part of the background to its creation. And the experiences of converts to Judaism has been that officially you're not supposed to remind someone they're a convert. Except when you call them to the Torah, they're referred to as a Ben Avraham or a Bat Sarah, a son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah, not their biological parents, because now they have a new pedigree, having joined the Jewish family. Again, not just belief, it's also that ethnic connection. And the social dynamics sometimes are problematic, and people remind them that you're not really Jewish. And sometimes converting doesn't include knowing what shlep means. There's a cultural acculturation that becomes part of the process that takes time. You have to be assimilated into the Jewish identity over time. Again, Judaism is not just a religion with a set of beliefs. Now, the word shiksa is definitely an insult. There's implications of promiscuity. There's that terrible phrase that makes it into the show, shiksas are for practice, that you date them to fool around, but when you're going to marry, you go back to a real Jewish woman. It's used too casually in the show, perhaps. But maybe this is something that the showrunner experienced in her own life, that she was still called the shiksa, even after she converted. And this goes even back to a story in the Bible. Remember the story of Ruth, who marries into a Jewish family, and then all the husbands die, and they begin to make their way back to the land of Israel. And she says, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. That sought to be a conversion. And the rest of the book, she's referred to as Ruth the Moabite. Can't leave it behind. And even if she were fully accepted and converted, of course, her kids would know that her grandparents on that side have a Christmas tree, or a Moabite equivalent for a Christmas tree. So it doesn't, that I love you, you're perfect, now change into being Jewish, doesn't change the fact that you weren't at one point and that the extended family is not, and it's still there. It's still part of the dynamic. Now, in any sitcom, there's going to be stereotyped characters. Not every one character can be complex and deep. Some of them are surface and jokey. So, for example, there's the mother who's still breastfeeding her 5-year-old. That's one of the characters. Or the shallow conversation they have about shallow topics. The cliquey exclusion of the newcomer, the interloper, the materialism, that old stereotype of the Jewish American princess definitely makes its appearance in the show. And Bina, the mother of the rabbi, is definitely a villain. And there's really no redemptive side to that character. She's bad to her daughter-in-law by being judgmental and cruel and domineering. She's bad to her granddaughter by imposing a bat mitzvah theme and this terrible dress that the granddaughter hates, but the grandmother doesn't care. She's bullying of all of her kids. At one point, when Noah tells her to stop berating Joanne, he intervenes on Joanne's behalf to stop the cruelty. She's so offended, she storms off like he's never done this before. Well, that's not a sympathetic character, to say the least. Now, we also have to point out, and many of the Jewish women writing about the show didn't say this, the non-Jewish women are also very stereotyped in the show. What are their stereotypes? They're stereotyped as promiscuous. Again, this podcast of these two single women who are sleeping around, and one of them sees a guy in a store who has a thick neck with tattoos on it and says, well, I don't like him, but I'm going to sleep with him anyways, and goes off to... I mean, that's insulting. They're not only promiscuous, they're drinkers. They show up with booze all the time. At one point, Joanne is trying to make friends with Esther and her friends watching a basketball game. And she says, when was the last time we had a drinking game? And Joanne and her sister say, last weekend. And the other ones say, in college. Well, that's stereotypes on both sides there. And a shallow focus on their appearance. You know, that's a very common theme in the non-Jewish women's dialogue with each other. At one point, Joanne says her worst fear in life is a bad facelift. And even when she has a serious moment later in that same episode, she says, you know, my worst fear really is a bad facelift, but then also maybe a fear about this relationship and getting in too deep and so on. And it creates a meaningful moment for the two of them, but that shallowness is still there. And even more profoundly, the non-Jewish women are depicted as not being able to express love easily. They're sort of emotionally stunted. They have this harsh exterior to keep people away from getting too close to them. No, that's also a problematic stereotype. Now, for me, I found some redemption and some complexity for two of the major Jewish women characters in the show. The first is the ex-Rebecca. At the end of the show, almost the last scene, she shows up and she actually talks with Joanne. And you feel some empathy for her and what she's lost, because her goal was always to be Mrs. Head Rabbi. That's what she wanted above all else, even if it meant she didn't necessarily love Noah as much as Noah's job. She wanted to be the Rebbitzin more than to be Mrs. Rocklaw. Even so, she's humanized because Joanne admits, you know, I had an obsession with you. And Rebecca said, you know, I had a bit of an obsession with you too. Sort of a mutual understanding there. And then she articulates what it's like to be Mrs. Head Rabbi, what she had envisioned for her life, the realities of this complex dynamic to Joanne. And it helps Joanne to think. Now, you could be conspiratorially thinking that she's trying to screw up everything and trying to throw her under the bus or get her to leave, and then she'll sweep back in. But I read it, at least, as coming from a genuine place of, this is what you're getting yourself into. And it's making her more sympathetic, if nothing else. So I felt better about Rebecca by the end, seeing that last scene. And the other character, who I think grows a bit, is her sister, Noah's sister-in-law, Esther. Right? Esther shows very clearly she's torn between actually liking Joanne on some level and seeing how she interacts with Bina, and she has she has someone to commiserate with about this. Or if Bina hates Joanne even more than Esther, then maybe Esther's in a better position. That's why she finally invites her to the bat mitzvah, because by some miracle you made me look good in front of my mother-in-law. But she invites her to the bat mitzvah, then tries to uninvite her to the bat mitzvah. She goes back and forth. She's still friends with Rebecca. That's her best friend. So how can she be friendly with Joanne and yet still be with Rebecca? There's a scene where it seems like she's torn about that reality. And then by the end, her love for her daughter supersedes the social expectations and supersedes even her loyalty to her mother-in-law. She commiserates with her daughter and says, this theme stinks. This dress stinks. Let me help you cut it off so it's shorter and you'll be happier. She says, if no one else is following the rules, then I'm going to do it too. So she grows a little bit, and now she still has a lot of suspicion. When she sees Joanne's sister Morgan talking to her husband Sasha near the end, there's some concern there. But frankly, if you watch their dynamic, I'd have some concern. I think that's a plot line for season 2, but we'll have to see. But I do think Esther comes back as a little bit better by the end of the show. And of course, the best woman character of all appears in episode 5. It's Rabbi Shira, the rabbi at the summer camp. She's wonderful. She's kind. She's also insightful to the human condition. She's open and welcoming. She's encouraging Joanne to explore more about what Jewish experience in life is like. And when Noah comes to talk to her about the problem he's having, she says to him, Judaism has been around for centuries. You know, I was your rabbi 20 years ago. But when I became a rabbi, there were very few women rabbis out there because Judaism has been around for 1,000 years and women have only been rabbis for 50 years. So sometimes tradition has to just deal with it, although she says something else. Well, that attitude of sometimes things change and tradition has to live with it sounds like humanistic Judaism. But it also sounds like the open and welcoming world of the new Jewish identity that will be open and welcoming to intermarried families as well. Overall, if I had to rate the show, I'd give it a 4.5 out of 5. It has funny and clever dialogue. It has largely believable characters. It's a plausible setting. And this is coming from someone who lives in the Jewish world and is very critical about that stuff. And it's generally accurate on the Jewish stuff. By the way, including on some of the Jewish stuff we might not want in public. That suspicion of the outsider, that imperfect welcoming, that is true to the Jewish experience, even if we don't want it broadcast on Netflix. And most importantly, the show opened up interesting conversations about love and about life and changing yourself for your partner and Jewishness in the 21st century. Well, we'll have to see what happens in season 2, because evidently somebody does want this, and there will be more to come.
It wasn't just the Jewish family who didn't accept Joanne, but it was Joanne's sister who is not accepting Noah. Yeah. And part of it is because she sees her sister changing and she doesn't want her sister to change, but it goes both ways. And it's also another thing that you mentioned is I feel like the non-Jewish people, except for Joanne, are all depicted as pretty dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's another layer to this critique where, you know, the people often look for themselves in media. And so Jewish people watching the show are looking at what the Jewish characters are doing. But if you have some empathy for all humanity, or maybe you yourself are partnered with someone who's not Jewish, and you see how they're being presented from Jewish eyes, then that also changes the dynamic. And definitely, Morgan is just as rejecting as the other siblings are and the other family members are on Noah's side. Part of it is the change, I think, but also part of it is her fear that Joanne is just never going to fit in this. It's the fear Joanne has. You know, what if I get to the end and I say no, and I can't convert. It's not who I am. That's going to break my heart. And so what Joanne is afraid of in episode 1 or 2 or whatever it was that she says this is part of what her sister is also afraid of. And her sister knows her as well as anybody. And in addition to seeing the change, I think is also afraid of what might happen.
But it's funny because and to go back to the all of the Jewish women, yeah, they're pretty horrible. But as a Jewish woman who married a non-Jewish man, we don't watch sitcoms. Like, that's not usually what we watch, but it was funny.
It was.
They were funny. So it was over the top, but I wouldn't necessarily be critical of it because it was funny and it was proven, stereotypes are there for a reason.
Right. Right.
So,
well, and some of the Jewish men don't come off that well either. The Jewish men at the bat mitzvah, when the two sisters walk in, they're like, they're drooling because here they are with this is actually the phrase shik's appeal. That's it as actually used. So they're out there and they're attractive. They're so attractive the men just can't stop themselves. Well, again, and these are all married men. They're older men. It's offensive in its own way. But that's part of the stereotyping process of sitcoms. The humor is built in there. Right.
Well, everything in this show was beyond the pale.
Right.
Because everything was exaggerated, but you didn't bring up Joanne's father and his gay life, being still with the mother. I mean, that was a whole story in itself, and they could have played up that more if they wanted. And maybe next season they will. But I thought that was hysterical.
Yeah. So the fact that Joanne's mother and father are still officially married, even though he's been gay for a long time, definitely was part of the comedy. Although Joanne comments on this at one point, she says, we thought about making our podcast about our gay dad and our mom, but that's been done to death. Like that's cliche at this point. So they wanted to go a different angle. So maybe that was the showrunners or the writers' allusion to the fact they didn't want to emphasize that theme over the core conflict that was the base of the show.
Well, try to count how many odd things were in this movie or this show. I mean, the different dichotomies of life. Every episode had many themes to it, which I thought was the writer made it very entertaining.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also what I like about some rabbinic portrayals is they don't make fun of the rabbi. Like the rabbi on Seinfeld was a clown, and that was the whole point. And I really didn't like that experience. But the rabbi here has some wisdom and says some interesting things. There's a wonderful scene in a novel called Here I Am by Jonathan Safran Foer, where this rabbi leads a funeral service. And it is one of the most beautiful funeral services I've ever read, seen, experienced. It's just done wonderfully with insight into the human condition and loss and connection. And I felt like that sometimes when Noah's giving a sermon, or he's talking about what's meaningful about Havdalah to him, or why there's 2 candles on Shabbat or whatever. They really gave him some meaty content that has some insight into the human condition. Even when he's counseling this couple and he channels Joanne to be more open about himself, and it helps the couple be open about themselves. I've had that same balancing dynamic of how much do I talk about myself in a counseling kind of setting with a couple or an individual. It helps to reveal some things to show that you've had similar experience, but they're not my therapist. So you have to find that right balancing act. And I thought that scene really played true to life, but also meaningful and moving. So there was a lot of really well done set pieces in the show with some insight.
I think the show is trying to find a balance between doing what it says it wants to do and exploring this and the rules of sitcoms. And there's so many times, and what Elliot referred to is, if you have a comic couple, what does a comic couple look like? We all know what a comic couple looks like. She's taller than he is. So there are a number of things that this is how sitcoms function. And they function with mismatch. They function with the change and surprise. They function with
the misunderstanding.
Right. We know we see these. I've seen this plot before. I've seen this plot on The Simpsons. I've seen this plot on over and over. And there were several times when this show is doing the sitcom thing. And when it's doing the sitcom thing, it's not. It wants to be a what do they call it? A dramedy. But right now it's a comedy. And my hope for the second season is that it leans into the dramedy and says, we can let some of the sitcom features go. We can let some of those things that all sitcoms do. We don't have to do those. We can move more into that's why it's.
You need the mic for people on one side.
Well, it's also probably why it got a second season. If they did do what I'm asking to do, it may not have been renewed.
That's what made it good for me, and why I didn't stop watching it, is because it had enough. The sitcom, if it had just been the sitcom stuff over and over and over and again, I would have gotten bored and I would have turned it off because I would have thought it was dumb. But it had enough of the real, like it felt real, and some of the things that they were going through and the conversations that they had were real.
Yeah.
And that's why we kept watching it. Wouldn't you say?
Well, I also liked that. I liked that they were written smart. You know, the characters were written smart. They were funny. They had sort of an understated sense of humor sometimes overstated, but they had fun with each other. You know, they were enjoying time together, and you enjoyed experiencing them together. So like when she claims that she's getting sick, so she can't go to the bat mitzvah, so then he says, oh, I better throw out this coffee right now. And then later on she says, you owe me for that coffee because you knew I was lying. And he said, well, I bought you that coffee, so you owe me a coffee. It's the kind of banter that you would really have from a real couple. And I really liked how they wrote those as not only believable, but entertaining and fun.
Speaking of sitcoms, there was another sitcom with a mixed marriage involving New York Jewry about 30 years ago called Mad About You with Helen Hunt and Paul Reiser. And it was a good show. It lasted a long time, and it didn't get quite so deeply into these issues.
I don't think they ever highlighted the ethnic or religious identity of either partner in the show. I think they dodged it.
Except it was perfectly obvious when you looked at it.
Yes, it was, and the blonde versus the brunette, like the casting and the parents and their behaviors. Yes, it was clearly marked that way, but it was nothing they ever talked about explicitly in the show. I think on purpose to not get into those challenging issues. Right, times change. Exactly.
Well, Annie Hall has that classic scene.
Yes.
So even that far back, and the scene I'm referring to for those who don't remember is that Woody Allen has a moment where he's at Annie Hall's family's table, and the camera pans, and all of a sudden he's got payas, and then we get a split screen between Annie Hall's family and Woody Allen's family. We go back and forth,
and Annie Hall's family are all WASP and upright and
the swap meets, talking about the swap
meets and boats, and the ham is really great this year. And his family, everyone's talking at the same time, and they're passing things around, and it's like anarchy, and it's drawing that very extreme contrast. But that's, again, the humor is the contrast between the two.
The other Woody Allen picture was when he was going to convert, and he brings home a bag and he takes out Wonder Bread and mayonnaise.
Or you could think about Lenny Bruce and his routine about what's Jewish and what's Goyish, and like lime jello he defines as not Jewish, where rye bread is Jewish. So, but again, it's all that cultural ethnic identity that the show didn't really dive into. But that will be another interesting question, because even if she does convert, is that enough? Is she Jewish enough? Or is she always going to have some of that, diversity ethnic experience?
That's a very good idea, in that I converted in 1959. It was very difficult to find a rabbi to do it at that time. And I was converted in a conservative church temple. And my relatives, my grandfather was a minister and my two uncles were ministers. And after the conversion, I was in limbo for a long time. It was very, very hard because I didn't have the culture and the history. We primarily used the New Testament, and the Jewish people used the Old Testament. So that's two entirely different worlds when you're studying as a child. And the only time it finally became more real was when I started my son in Hebrew school. And so I would go to Hebrew school with him. And that was much more real than the conversion that the rabbis had given me. And the first time they told me that I had to go for a mikvah, my relatives said, nobody goes to that anymore. And the rabbi said, if you don't go, I'm not converting you. And that was the first and last.
Right. Yeah, this is that complexity. And in this case, I actually had someone ask when I posted I was going to be talking about this on Facebook. Someone commented and said, well, maybe part of the tension in the family is they're worried that the non-Jewish woman is going to push him to convert to Christianity. I said,
it's a rabbi.
She's not religious at all. And they've actually found in studies of intermarried couples that often the non-Jewish partner is largely secular. They're not going to church every Sunday either. So I sometimes will describe those partnerships where the non-Jewish partner never goes to church and the Jewish partner very rarely goes to synagogue. I'll call them interfaithless couples, because neither one is particularly religious, but they're from different cultural backgrounds and experiences, and they find their middle ground in Chrismukkah or in some variety of a home and home series where they go to each of the grandparents at different times. They make it work. And there have been intermarried couples that did not involve conversion that have lasted their entire lives and had a wonderful, warm, loving partnership. And there have been Jewish couples that have been terribly matched together. There's an old and terrible joke. Why is a Jewish divorce so expensive? Because it's worth it. So someone asked on the chat, did the show address how children of intermarriage will be treated? Not at all. It did not talk at all about an adult person who was raised from an intermarried family or about the potential of these two having children. Did not come up, as I can recall, at all. And I watched the series twice. So I don't think it's come up. I would bet you $5 that it will come up in season 2, because that's a question that comes up all the time. They did, check 3 of the boxes of the most common things of there won't be Jews anymore, and what will the rabbi think, and what will the congregation think of the rabbi, and what will the rabbi's mother think? So they check those boxes. But what will you do with the kids? They haven't talked about yet. I'm positive it's coming up in season 2.
I have a former student who is an Orthodox rabbi with a non-Jewish mother. And yes, his mother, he was the product of intermarriage, grew up right here in Deerfield. In moving into the Orthodox community, he had to have 2 conversions because his original conversion was not good enough. He actually had to change his name because he had a name that related to his mom's, his first name. He was Sean. His last name is Yankovic, so that's not a problem. He's Shmuley now. He's Shmuley, but it really, when you ask them how Jewish enough, are you not Jewish enough? He over and over got the not Jewish enough.
Yeah,
and he's an Orthodox rabbi.
And the very first bar mitzvah we had at Kol Hadash was Sean Finnegan's bar mitzvah.
Oh. No, Sean was at Beth Or.
Oh, that was still at Beth Or?
It's still at Beth Or.
Okay.
I'm still in touch with Sean Finnegan.
Yep.
I loved that we could bar mitzvah Sean Finnegan. That was a beautiful thing.